I built a $99 million tech empire. But my brother called me a useless dropout. The next day changed everything. The Ridgeway Club in downtown Chicago gleamed with old money and selective memories. The kind of place where legacies were toasted under crystal chandeliers and daughters like me were politely ignored. That night, the Simpson family was hosting a celebration in honor of my brother Caleb's promotion to executive partner at our father's real estate conglomerate. Caleb had just turned 33, and my father made sure everyone knew the firm was being passed into the right hands. My name wasn't on the invitation, but Rachel, my CMO and oldest friend, had forwarded it to me with a note. You should go, if only to remind them, you're still real. I arrived late, wearing a simple navy dress and my mother's old pendant, something that reminded me of who I'd once been before all the noise. I stayed near the back, near the bar, nursing a club soda while listening to familiar voices discuss property tax deferments and bond structuring like bedtime stories. My phone buzzed twice. Once from Owen, asking if I'd reviewed the updated server redundancy models before the Singapore pitch, and once from Lena, my first investor, reminding me gently to breathe. I didn't respond. I was waiting for the moment I could slip out unnoticed. Then Caleb raised his glass. From where I stood, I could see the stage and the expressions of all the men who had once called me a bright kid with no direction. Caleb stood beside our father, his tailored tux immaculate, his confidence rehearsed and inherited. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight, he began. And I already knew where it was going. And of course, my sister Jessica is here, somewhere, he said, pretending to scan the room. Eyes turned, then turned away. She's always had a creative streak. Dropped out of Yale. I started something with computers and apartments. I never really got it. Anyway, she built a company. Briefly. Now she's struggling. And I've offered to help her transition out gracefully. Sometimes, family has to step in before things fall apart. The audience chuckled. Someone clapped. My father smiled, like he always did, calm, proud, absent. I didn't wait for the toast to end. I left the ballroom before the glass clinking started. The marble foyer felt colder than outside. My heels echoed as I passed the concierge, ignoring the pity in his glance. The moment I stepped into the car, I exhaled, not because I was embarrassed, not even because I was angry. It was something deeper than that. I had been dismissed by them so many times that it no longer burned, it calcified. They still thought I was the girl who walked out of Yale halfway through junior year after mom died, too heartbroken to keep pretending that algorithmic trading models were my purpose. They didn't know what I'd built with Propnex. They didn't know about the $60 million offer I had declined that morning. They didn't know that the Singapore pitch, scheduled for 9 a.m. the next day, I could take us global. And they certainly didn't know that Caleb had already sent an email to one of my seed investors last week, pretending to be acting on my behalf to begin strategic acquisition discussions. I hadn't told them, because I was still deciding whether I wanted to fight this war or just walk away and build something new from the ground up. But as I watched the club disappear in the rearview mirror, one thing became clear. They didn't just want to erase me. They wanted to own me. Rewrite my story as a cautionary tale, fold my work into Caleb's resume, and call it family synergy. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not because I needed their validation. I had stopped needing that the day mom died. But because there were 27 employees back at the Propnex office who had given everything to build something that mattered. Because Lena had taken a chance on me when no one else would. Because Owen had rewritten his entire career to help design our adaptive learning engine. Because I wasn't done yet. That night, I didn't sleep. I rewrote the pitch deck for Singapore. Then checked our legal backup on IP protections. Then filed a preemptive injunction notice draft with our corporate attorney, just in case Caleb tried anything formal. At 3:17 a.m., I logged into our private Git mirror and moved the most sensitive parts of our architecture to a second layer of encryption. Redundant. Maybe. But I'd learned never to assume good intentions from men in suits who spoke in family metaphors. By the time the sun rose, I'd built the beginnings of my counterattack. Caleb thought he humiliated me that night. But what he did was give me absolute clarity. He took off the last mask. And in doing so, he gave me everything I needed to win. Before I was the so-called embarrassment of the Simpson family. I was just a girl who couldn't sit through another lecture on macroeconomic frameworks without feeling like she was wasting her life. Yale was impressive on paper, but I remember walking out of my data structures midterm halfway through. Not because I couldn't finish it, but because I finally realized I didn't want to. My mom had passed 6 months earlier, and suddenly, everything that used to feel like ambition began to taste like someone else's expectation. I spent weeks after her funeral wandering the city in worn-out sneakers and noise-canceling headphones, sketching ideas in cheap spiral notebooks, slowly realizing the thing I wanted to build didn't exist yet. Everyone thought I was spiraling, but it felt like the first time I was actually breathing. When I told my father I was taking a leave of absence, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just looked at me the way you might look at a chair with a missing leg. He said, "You'll regret this, Jessica. People don't invest in chaos." I still remember the exact shade of silence in that room after he left. That was the last time he called me his daughter in public. I started Propnex a year later, with the little money left in my mother's insurance policy. It wasn't even called Propnex back then. It was just a prototype on a borrowed laptop in a sublet studio over a dry cleaner's shop in Lincoln Park. I coded during the day and waited tables at night, running user simulations on real estate agent behaviors and housing pattern data until my fingers cramped. The idea was simple, or at least I thought it was. Build an AI engine that didn't just find houses for buyers, but learned to understand why people made decisions about where to live, when to sell, what they valued over time. Not price alone, not square footage, but human patterns. I wanted it to feel like intuition with structure. And I didn't know a single investor who'd take a call from someone who'd dropped out of college and didn't even have a logo. Until I met Lena. Lena Moretti had built and sold 2 AI startups before the age of 40 and had the sort of presence that made rooms shift subtly when she walked in. I cornered her after she spoke at a tech event, pitching my idea in the stairwell like a teenager with a science fair project. She didn't laugh. She just asked, "What problem are you solving that others aren't seeing?" I told her I wasn't trying to optimize listings. I was trying to predict emotional trust in property behavior. She stared at me for 5 long seconds, then said, "That's the weirdest and most specific thing I've heard all month. Let's get coffee." That was the beginning. With Lena's backing, and Owen joining as CTO, we rebuilt the engine from scratch and rebranded the platform. By year 3, we had 30 employees, a waiting list of pilot partners, and a feature in Techverse that labeled us as AI with intuition. Rachel left her marketing firm to lead our growth strategy, and together, we secured our first institutional funding round. The valuation reached $15 million, then 40, and by the time we finished integrating our predictive retention module, the number crossed 99. But none of that mattered to my family. At Thanksgiving dinner last year, my father still introduced me as Jessica, who's doing something in the digital space. Caleb joked about how I finally learned to pay rent with Python. Every time I tried to explain the depth of our emotional inference engine, or how we had mapped over 18,000 behavioral sequences tied to real estate stress decisions, someone at the table would interrupt to ask if I ever thought of going back to school. The irony is that I never wanted their recognition. Not at first. I just wanted the noise to stop. But the further I succeeded on my own terms, the louder their dismissal became. Caleb made partner at Simpson Holdings, using every tool that had been handed to him since prep school. And yet every time I landed a deal, He'd find a way to frame it as reckless luck. When Lena introduced us to Thomas Lin's group in Singapore, and they expressed interest in licensing our engine for international rollout, Caleb found out within 3 days. He sent a casual email to our investor, Mason, suggesting I was overleveraged and understructured. Mason called me that night, asking if we needed a financial review, which was strange. Since our burn rate was the lowest in the portfolio, that was the first time I realized Caleb wasn't just watching. He was preparing something, and I didn't know yet if he wanted to acquire me, dismantle, or both. But I knew one thing for sure: he didn't understand what this company really was. And that was going to be his mistake. 3 days after the gala, I walked into the Propnex conference room at 8 a.m. sharp, my coffee untouched, my mind still buzzing from the hours I didn't sleep. The to-do list was clear. Owen needed updates from the tech team on contextual dialogue management for the Singapore demo. Rachel had to finalize the rollout narrative in case we got early-stage approval. Everything looked stable on paper, but the quiet in the room felt off. Marcus, our head of finance, never showed up early unless something was wrong. He sat at the far end of the table, scrolling through his iPad like he didn't want to look up. When the others trickled out after the tech updates, he stayed behind, closed the door, and looked at me like someone who didn't want to deliver what he was about to say. Jessica, he started, voice flat. Mason called. He's reevaluating his position in the next funding round. He says there's chatter in the space about our financial trajectory. I waited. I didn't speak. He wouldn't say where it came from. Marcus continued. But he implied Caleb's been having conversations. He's suggesting to some of our early investors that we're overextended and behind schedule. I didn't flinch. I just stared at the black coffee in my hand and registered what it meant. Caleb hadn't wasted a moment. He wasn't throwing petty jabs anymore. He was moving pieces behind the scenes, like my father used to do during acquisition negotiations, never confronting directly, just shaping the room until his opponent lost control of it. He was doing exactly what I expected, but faster. And that told me something critical: he'd started planning this well before the gala. The insult at the party wasn't his first move. It was already halfway through the play. What unsettled me wasn't the rumor itself, but how quickly it had taken hold. It meant Caleb had identified every single person who might hesitate, then seeded just enough doubt to make them lean away. He wasn't trying to destroy me outright. He wanted me off balance, questioning myself, worn down by the second-guessing of people I used to trust. That afternoon, I started making calls. Not to explain or justify, but to calmly, clearly remind our early backers what we were building and where we stood. I walked Mason through our current cash flow and operational costs, shared dashboard access with 3 others, forwarded the latest technical report from our Singapore pilot with detailed engagement projections. Most of them were receptive. Some asked good questions. But 2 of them, the ones I knew Caleb had approached first, kept their voices neutral and their responses vague. They didn't say they believed him. They didn't have to. I'd grown up in a house where silence was the sharpest tool. My father didn't need to raise his voice to correct us. He just went quiet long enough for you to doubt yourself. Later that evening, I ran a full security scan on our systems and did a manual check on project access logs. Everything looked intact, until I found an unusual IP address tied to Julia's credentials. Julia was our lead AI architect, and one of the few who understood the intricacies of our emotional reasoning layer. I tried calling her twice. No answer. The next morning, she submitted her resignation via email, citing the need for a new environment with expanded growth opportunities. That same afternoon, she updated her LinkedIn profile. Her new title was Senior AI Solutions Engineer at Simtech Group, a back-end partner to Simpson Holdings on multiple contracts. I closed the browser, jaw tight, and said nothing. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. Julia had been poached, likely with an inflated offer and vague promises of autonomy. She couldn't replicate what we built on her own. But if Caleb's plan was to capture a partial framework, enough to repackage and claim first-to-market positioning, then this was exactly the kind of move he'd make. He didn't need to win outright. He just had to make sure I couldn't steal my edge, fracture my team, force a timeline collapse. It was calculated, efficient, and deeply personal. That night, Rachel found me sitting alone in the office. The Singapore pitch deck spread across my desk in 3 different formats. She didn't say anything at first, just set a hot mug of tea down in front of me and leaned against the door. "He won't stop," she said finally, voice low and steady. "Not until you sell or there's nothing left to sell." I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know," I said. "But this time, I'm not stepping back." The week after Julia left, things moved faster than I expected. Not in the way progress moves, but in the way erosion happens. Quiet at first, invisible, if you don't pay attention. And then suddenly, the ground underneath you feels unfamiliar. Our Singapore contact, Thomas Lin, called for a quick clarification meeting about the scope of integration. He was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. He danced around his questions, but the meaning was obvious. Someone had told him our team was unstable, that our internal architecture had bottlenecks, that we were months behind schedule. None of it was true. We had just hit a major benchmark the week before, and I had the logs to prove it. I walked him through the progress myself, point by point, backing every explanation with timestamps and server logs. He listened carefully, nodded slowly, and promised to circle back after board review. It wasn't a no, but it wasn't a yes anymore. I spent the next 2 days answering emails from stakeholders I hadn't heard from in months. People who had once called us pioneers were now asking if we had pivot plans. They asked how many senior engineers we'd lost, if we were exploring strategic partnerships, the coded language of retreat. They didn't want us to fail. They just didn't want to be the last ones holding the bag if we did. When I mentioned it to Marcus, he didn't even blink. "Investors follow scent," he said. "Right now, they think they smell smoke." I knew where the smoke was coming from, and I knew who was fanning it. But the one thing I didn't expect was how organized the campaign had become. Rachel pulled me aside late one evening with a tablet in hand. She had screenshots of internal financial briefings from Simtech that looked eerily familiar to our own internal models. Caleb hadn't just lured Julia away. He was replicating our projections, massaging them into his own deck, and packaging them as a future solution under his name. The reports even used similar language around behavioral forecasting, a phrase I had coined with Owen during our first month of prototype design. They weren't even being subtle anymore. They were trying to rebrand our innovation before we could finish building it. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed at the office and reopened every line of code tied to the emotional mapping logic. Not to change it, but to verify. I wasn't going to let them accuse us of copying our own invention. Around dry M. Owen walked in with a large thermos of black coffee and didn't say a word. He sat next to me, pulled up the live test environment, and started working without needing context. This wasn't the first time we'd built under pressure, but it felt like the first time we were defending ourselves with our product alone. By the following Monday, the weight of the silence was heavier than the attacks. Jessica, our operations manager, told me she overheard 2 interns whispering about job openings at Simtech. Kyle, one of our mid-level developers, casually asked if we had a succession plan. If things went sideways, I wasn't angry at them. They were just trying to survive. But it made something clear. The idea of us failing was now part of the conversation, and that made it real. I called an emergency meeting. Not with investors, not with board advisors, with my team. I stood in our main bullpen and told the truth, that we were under attack, that the rumors weren't random, that someone was deliberately trying to dismantle what we'd built, and that it wasn't because we were weak, it was because we were dangerous. I didn't sugarcoat our situation. I didn't promise things would be easy. But I promised one thing. We weren't going down quietly. We had the data, the tech, the contracts, and the momentum. We just had to hold our line long enough for the market to catch up to the truth. No one applauded. No one clapped, but no one left the room either. After the meeting, Rachel pulled me aside and said, "This only works if they see you standing." I nodded. I was exhausted, bruised from weeks of defending instead of building, but I wasn't done. The truth was, I'd been through worse. I'd been told by my father that I was undisciplined, by professors that I lacked focus, by old family friends that I was chasing vanity. None of them knew the hours I'd spent fixing data architecture bugs at 2 a.m., or the way I'd sold my car to meet payroll that first winter. I didn't need their validation now. I just needed 3 more weeks. 3 weeks to finish the adaptive decision engine. 3 weeks to lock the Singapore contract. 3 weeks to prove that the version of the story they were trying to rewrite still belonged to me. 2 days after the team meeting, we lost another engineer. Greg didn't leave a note or ask for a conversation. He just cleared his desk after hours and sent an email that read like a boilerplate resignation template. It wasn't a surprise, but it still felt personal. Greg had been with us since version 2 of the predictive engine, and he was the one who'd helped fix the original context loop bug in our voice learning interface. His code still ran through every version of our assistant's real-time processing. Losing him meant more than filling a role. It meant rewriting key segments of our next release without the person who understood them best. I didn't blame him. I knew where he was going. Simtech's headhunter had started calling people directly now. They weren't even hiding it. They offered guaranteed bonuses, 2-year contracts, and titles inflated just enough to make the move feel like a step up. The message was clear. They weren't just trying to win. They were trying to gut us before the demo could even happen. Rachel walked into my office with a stack of campaign drafts and the expression of someone who was waiting for me to snap. I didn't. I just moved Greg's name off the delivery board and asked her if she'd heard back from Lena. She nodded. Lena had gotten wind of the situation through 2 of her own back-channel investors, both of whom had received calls from Caleb's team. They weren't positioning their company as a competitor. They were painting us as unstable, and themselves as the natural place for continuity. The strategy was smart. No confrontation. No legal lines crossed. Just enough misdirection and tone to seed doubt. Lena said the whispers were spreading faster than truth could catch up. She told Rachel she'd call me directly when she had a plan. But I already knew what the plan would be. Either we landed something massive and undeniable in the next 2 weeks, or we'd start bleeding talent and capital faster than we could recover. That night, I drove across the city in the rain and sat outside the old cafe where I used to meet my mom. I didn't go in. I just parked under the faded red awning and watched the steam from the bakery windows fog up the glass. The same streetlights flickered like they always had, casting soft gold light on a sidewalk that felt like another version of my life. For a moment, I thought about what it would feel like to walk away. Not dramatically, not with fire and lawsuits and revenge, just quiet. Accept one of the safer acquisition offers. Keep a fraction of the vision alive. Let someone else finish the work. And finally sleep. Not the shallow kind I'd been doing. The kind with blinking notifications and half-written mental code. But actual sleep, where my body didn't brace for another phone call every hour. I imagined calling Caleb and saying, "Fine, you win. You can have the technology, the story, the headlines. You can take the spotlight and let me step out of it." I imagined the peace of no longer having to explain why something mattered to people who only understood metrics. But that version of peace wasn't real. It was just another version of silence. And I'd lived enough of my life trying to survive other people's silence. The next morning, Marcus met me at the office before sunrise. He'd been up all night, tracking Simtech's financial disclosures. What he found wasn't just leverage. It was the opening we hadn't seen coming. Caleb's team had overcommitted to 3 separate enterprise clients, all involving adaptive AI rollouts. All promising timelines they couldn't possibly meet without a functioning engine. One of those clients was a logistics firm based in Singapore, the same region where we were negotiating. The overlap wasn't coincidence. It was strategy gone too far. They had promised something they didn't own, then tried to acquire us, before anyone noticed. If we failed, they could write us off and buy the pieces. But if we delivered, it would expose that they had been selling vapor. That was the first moment in weeks where the weight on my chest shifted. Not gone, but no longer crushing. I turned to Marcus and asked him what we needed to do to speed up the final integration. He didn't hesitate. We can get it done in 10 days. But it'll cost more, and people will burn out. I nodded. Then we protect them, where we can. We rotate shifts. We deliver early. We show the world what they tried to bury. He smiled for the first time in days. Not because it would be easy, but because we still had a shot. And I wasn't walking away from this version of the story. The office lights never turned off that week. We rotated shifts, dimmed half the building after midnight, and rationed caffeine like it was battlefield supplies. I set up a cot in the server room not because I was being dramatic, but because it was the only place I could think clearly without constant interruption. Owen moved his whiteboard into the hallway, scribbling algorithm notes between coffee refills and sync meetings. Rachel stopped wearing heels altogether and started managing team morale with a steady supply of late-night Thai food and her own version of daily updates, short, blunt, and brutally honest. We weren't operating like a startup anymore. We were operating like a company at war. And everyone knew what was at stake. The Singapore demo was scheduled for the following Tuesday. If we hit our benchmarks, it wouldn't just restore investor confidence. It would signal to the entire industry that we were still building, still improving, and still the original source of the technology our competitors were now pretending to own. If we failed, even once, they'd use it to validate everything Caleb had been feeding the market. 3 nights before the demo, I received an email from Simtech. It was polite, indirect, and filled with legal ambiguity. They were evaluating IP overlaps and monitoring adjacent developments in behavioral modeling. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't even a formal warning. But the message was clear. They were nervous. Nervous enough to signal a threat before we'd even launched. I didn't reply. I forwarded the email to Lena, who called 5 minutes later and said, "That's not a warning. That's a stalling tactic. They're hoping you blink first." I didn't. I deleted the message and went back to finalizing our updated inference trees for multilingual adaptation. Caleb was playing politics. I was finishing code. The night before the demo, it rained harder than I'd seen in months. I remember looking out the 17th floor window, watching the water blur the city into smears of gray and amber. Rachel walked in with 2 takeout bags and sat without speaking. She placed a napkin in front of me, and then, almost as an afterthought, said, "Jessica, if this doesn't work, I'll still be here, but I need to know you will too." I didn't answer right away. I had been running on adrenaline for so long, I'd forgotten what steady ground felt like. My brain kept flashing images of old conversations, my father telling me I lacked strategic depth, Caleb saying I was too emotional to lead anything complex. Even Julia once suggesting I hire someone else to manage operations so I could focus on the creative. It was strange how those voices always got louder right before something important. I set down my chopsticks and said, "If this doesn't work, then I'll build something else." But this time, I finished what I started. The morning of the demo, the server room felt like a chapel. Quiet, cold, reverent. Owen had barely slept, but his eyes were sharp. Marcus brought in an investor packet with updated cash flow projections based on the potential rollout deal. Thomas Lin and two of his Singapore-based engineers logged on from their boardroom at exactly 9:00 a.m. We didn't use the slides. We didn't show graphs. We ran the engine live. We fed it unpredictable customer behavior sequences, cultural, data shifts, and overlapping language profiles. It adapted in real time. When it responded with nuanced adjustments based on emotional tone recognition, Thomas leaned forward and didn't speak for several seconds. Then he said, "Can you replicate this response using new regional data we did?" And it worked. The system didn't just match expectations. It exceeded every technical spec from our original pitch. 20 minutes later, Thomas smiled for the first time and said, "Let's proceed to contract structuring." After the call, no one cheered. No one shouted or popped champagne. Everyone just sat still for a moment, as if trying to understand what it meant to finally feel weight leave the room. Rachel was the first to speak. She looked at me, her voice lower than usual, and said, "They're going to hate that we pulled this off." I didn't disagree, because this wasn't just a technical win, it was a narrative shift. Everything Caleb had spent weeks building rumors, doubt, pressure was now vulnerable to one simple question from the market. If their version was better, why did ours just outperform it in real time? Later that afternoon, I checked the Propnex inbox and saw a reply from a West Coast investor who had previously gone silent. He wrote a single sentence. "Congratulations, I underestimated you. I won't make that mistake again." I stared at that line for a long time, not because I needed the apology, but because it reminded me that success never erases the damage from betrayal, it just makes it irrelevant. The morning after the Singapore demo, the office felt different. Not louder or more energized, but grounded in a way I hadn't felt in months. People moved with focus again. The kind of calm that only comes when chaos has passed without completely destroying everything in its path. The development team had slept in shifts. Rachel had already begun briefing our media contact, and Marcus was coordinating with Lena to structure next steps on the funding side. We had momentum, but I wasn't naive enough to think the campaign against us was over. I knew Caleb, and I knew what losing control of a narrative did to men like him. It didn't humble them. It made them escalate. Later that afternoon, Lena called with a clipped tone in her voice that told me she wasn't calling to celebrate. She'd received a leak, not from our side, but from a source close to Simtech's financial wing. The numbers showed a growing gap between what they promised in their enterprise contracts and what they had the infrastructure to deliver. The technical language matched our original framework too closely for coincidence. They had sold the idea of a product they didn't have, and bet everything on acquiring us before that lie unraveled. Now that we had launched publicly and proved the system worked, they had no fallback. Lena said quietly, "You just became their liability, Jessica, not their competition. Their proof of fraud." I hung up and looked out the window for a long time, not to reflect or compose myself, but to measure. For months, I had been playing defense, clarifying, defending, proving. Now, for the first time, they were the ones explaining. Caleb had used whispers and leverage to shape a false reality. But markets only believe in stories until data interrupts. And yesterday, we had given them data. Clean, visible, undeniable. But I didn't want revenge. I wasn't interested in public humiliation or headlines. What I wanted was very simple. I wanted distance. I wanted to finish what I started, without having to wade through someone else's need for power. That night, I met Lena and Rachel at a quiet wine bar near River North. No fanfare. No team celebration. Just the three of us in a back booth, with too many unread notifications between us. Lena ordered for the table and leaned in. "The story isn't over," she said, voice calm. "There's still one move left to make." I knew what she meant. The question wasn't whether we were going to expose what Caleb had done. The question was how. If we went public, it would burn bridges. Not just with him, but with the firms that had backed him. If we stayed quiet, it would protect our position but risk repeating the same pattern if they rebuilt under a new shell company. Rachel looked at me and said, "This can't just be about winning a round. It has to close the loop." I didn't answer them right away. I just sat there, sipping wine, listening to the rain hit the window, thinking of every time my father had called Caleb measured and built for legacy, while I was described as intuitive and independent, like those were traits that didn't belong in real business. They had spent years building a version of the truth that looked solid on the outside, but was hollow underneath. They didn't expect me to last. And now that I had, they couldn't afford the silence anymore. The next morning, Lena arranged a private briefing with two journalists who specialized in tech transparency and investor accountability. We didn't hand them a takedown story. We gave them numbers, internal memos from Simtech's contract briefs, timeline inconsistencies, cross-referenced claims versus actual product capability, and one crucial document that had been sent to a logistics partner in Singapore promising adaptive response functionality 6 months before we launched it, based on phrasing lifted directly from our demo slides. We didn't ask them to spin anything. We let the data speak. 2 days later, the first article dropped. The headline wasn't loud, but the content was precise. Within hours, Caleb's name trended on industry boards. Simtech's valuation dropped by 13%. And two major clients suspended rollout pending internal review. That evening, I sat alone in my office. Lights low, inbox full, and a legal email from Simtech marked as request for discussion. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to negotiate silence. I stared at it, then deleted it. The story had already left their control, and I had no interest in stepping back into shadows I'd spent years escaping. By the end of that week, the phone calls started shifting. Investors who had once hesitated now circled back, pretending their distance had been strategic. Strategic silence, they called it. Industry patience. Careful observation. I didn't call them out. I didn't need to. The Singapore rollout had triggered a domino effect we couldn't have bought with marketing. 2 enterprise partners scheduled private demos, and one offered a joint statement of intent before the month was over. Simtech, on the other hand, issued a vague press release denying any wrongdoing while quietly deactivating pages on their website that mentioned their AI product roadmap. Caleb didn't reach out. Neither did my father. Their side had gone completely quiet. The kind of quiet you only hear after a storm has exposed the rot beneath the surface. Rachel walked into my office with a small bottle of champagne and 2 glasses, then set them down without a word. I looked at her and said, "It's not over yet." She nodded, but didn't take the bottle back. "It's over enough," she said. And for once, I didn't argue, because she was right. The worst part wasn't the sabotage. It wasn't the betrayal or the dismissive way they treated my work. The worst part was how many people had stayed quiet when it mattered. People who knew what Caleb was doing, or at least suspected it, but said nothing because the risk of speaking was heavier than the burden of watching. That kind of silence changes you. It hardens something inside. Not into anger, but into resolve. Into a kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need to be loud to carry weight. I spent the next week cleaning up the mess. Not just from them, but from everything we'd neglected while trying to survive. Rewriting policies, locking down contracts, renegotiating developer terms, so the people who stayed wouldn't just feel appreciated but protected. Jessica, or operations lead, built a new reporting framework that gave team leads more autonomy and security. Marcus began working with a second legal team, focused entirely on protecting intellectual property in future rollouts. Owen finally took 2 days off. I forced Rachel to take 3. I didn't leave the office, but but I started sleeping again. Not deeply. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to start seeing the outlines of something new forming beneath the wreckage. One afternoon, as I was reviewing the revised equity structure for our Singapore expansion, I received a handwritten envelope with no return address. The handwriting was familiar. It was my father's. Inside was a single page, written in the kind of formal tone that always sounded like it belonged in a contract. He didn't apologize. He never used that word. He said he regretted the way things unfolded, and that he hoped we could find a path forward that honors both perspectives. He mentioned legacy. He mentioned timing. And he mentioned family unity. It read like a ceasefire dressed as concern. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not because I planned to respond, but because I wanted to remember the exact moment they realized they had lost control of the story. That same night, Caleb finally broke the silence. A message, short and carefully worded, requesting a meeting to explore mutual ground. I read it once. Then again. It was the same tone he used when trying to soften a negotiation, to make it seem like everyone wins. But I wasn't negotiating anymore. Not with someone who tried to dismantle everything I'd built, and then asked to share in the rebuilding, only after it became clear I didn't need saving. I didn't reply. Not because I was trying to be superior or cold, but because some things don't need words to be understood. Silence, in the right moment, becomes an answer of its own. By the weekend, the Singapore team confirmed full integration had begun. The rollout was officially in motion. A major industry site published an in-depth piece on our journey, tracing our progress from prototype to launch, and noting, without needing to name names, that Propnex had succeeded where larger firms had failed. I read the article in my apartment with the windows open and the city humming outside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. I thought of my mother, and how she used to tell me that disruption wasn't about noise or rebellion. It was about building something so steady, so undeniable, that the system eventually has to bend around it. That night, as the city lights flickered through the blinds, I realized something I hadn't been ready to say out loud until now. I had survived them. I had outgrown them. And I had done it without becoming them. A month passed, then another. Our rollout in Singapore not only held, it thrived. Within 6 weeks, 2 other clients from Southeast Asia joined the platform, and our predictive engine had been adopted across 3 logistics chains and 2 education systems. The technology spoke for itself. But what surprised me most was how quickly people began treating our presence as something inevitable. Like we had always been there. Like we hadn't nearly vanished a few months prior. That was the strange thing about winning quietly. There was no parade. No dramatic shift in skyline or headlines. Just the slow, steady replacement of doubt with trust. Of questions with clarity. One morning, while reviewing a systems report, I got a calendar notification. Rachel had booked a team lunch. No agenda, no client, just a long table in a quiet part of town where everyone could breathe. And remember, we were not machines. I almost canceled. My instinct was still to stay on guard, to keep proving and fixing and guarding against a second wave of betrayal. But I went, and I watched my team laugh. Eat too much. Share stories I had never heard. For the first time, in what felt like years, I saw them as people again. Not just colleagues or warriors. Real people who had stayed when they didn't have to. Later that week, I visited the original office building where Propnex had started. It was being remodeled into a shared workspace now, with polished concrete floors and curated plants. No one really watered. I stood outside the old entrance, remembering the first day I opened those doors with nothing but a laptop, a pitch deck, and a name no one could pronounce correctly. Back then, we didn't even have a product, just an idea and the will to outwork whoever stood in the way. I took a photo of the entrance and sent it to Owen. He replied with a single word. Still standing. It didn't need more. That weekend, I was invited to speak at a panel on ethical AI practices. I declined the first request. Then the second. I wasn't ready to become the face of something that had nearly broken me. But on the third request, I paused. It wasn't about spotlight. It was about narrative. I had spent months cleaning up someone else's false story. Maybe now it was time to start writing my own. I said yes. The event was modest. A tech campus auditorium. 60 people. Most of them, students or founders still holding their first idea, like it might catch fire if they loosened their grip. I spoke plainly. No slides. No rehearsed slogans. I told them how we built something people said we couldn't. How I was told I wasn't suited to lead, to scale, to last. And how sometimes, silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, it's strategy. I ended with a line I hadn't planned. You don't have to be louder than them. You just have to last longer. After the talk, a young woman came up to me. She had a notebook full of sketches and system diagrams, and her voice shook a little when she asked, "How do you keep going when the people you trust the most are the ones who try to bury you?" I didn't answer immediately. I looked at her hands, the way they gripped the notebook like it was armor. Then, I said, "You survive first. Then you rebuild. But never try to become what broke you." That night, as I walked home under a quiet sky, I thought of Caleb. I hadn't heard from him again. Last I checked, SimTech was under quiet restructuring. No press. No scandal. Just the kind of internal shifts companies make when the truth finally costs more than the illusion. And my father, well, he hadn't written again. The silence from both of them had changed. Not defensive. Not proud. Just irrelevant. They were no longer the center of the story. I was no longer orbiting anyone else's definition of worth. Back at the apartment, I lit a candle, opened my laptop, and watched the product usage map pulse with activity across time zones. Red lines stretching from Singapore to Seoul, from Bangkok to Berlin. We hadn't gone viral. We hadn't exploded. We had rooted. Quietly. Deeply. And no one could take that away. 6 months after the launch, I received an invitation. Not from Caleb. Not from my father. From the very investment group that once voted me off my own board. It was worded carefully. Almost academically polite. They were hosting a leadership summit in Palo Alto and wanted me to speak on resilient innovation. I knew the game. This wasn't an apology. It was an alignment strategy. Their funds had begun flowing back into companies with sustainable AI ethics. Propnex was now seen as both resilient and scalable. The kind of startup that weathered storms without collapsing under its own myth. They wanted proximity to what had survived. I didn't accept immediately. I let the message sit in my inbox for 3 days while I kept doing the work. Reviewing system reports, signing off expansion plans for Latin America. Reading a proposal from a young female engineer in Chile, whose algorithm mirrored our earliest design. I kept building, because that's what I'd always done. When I finally accepted the invitation, I didn't plan a dramatic speech or prepare a presentation meant to impress. I walked into the panel wearing the same blazer I'd worn the day Caleb had told me I was unfit to lead. Not as symbolism, just as memory. The room was full of familiar faces. People who had looked through me during meetings, people who once called me too intense, too careful, or worse, difficult. Now they greeted me with half smiles and firm handshakes. One of them even said, "I knew you'd come through." I didn't correct him. The thing about memory is it's elastic for those who didn't carry the bruises. Let them have their fiction. I had the facts. During the panel, someone asked if I had any regrets. I paused long enough to make the room lean in. Then I said, "I regret trusting people who never wanted me to succeed." There was a beat of silence before the moderator pivoted. but the room heard it. I didn't say it to wound. I said it because it was the truth. And sometimes, naming the truth without anger is more powerful than trying to force anyone to own it. After the event, I stood outside the venue under the muted California sun. A young founder approached me quietly. Someone I didn't know. She said her co-founder had tried to push her out once the funding came in, told her she was no longer strategic enough. Her voice didn't shake, but I could feel the weight of it in her silence. I looked at her and said, "Keep the receipts. Not to use them, just to remember who you were when they tried to write you out." She smiled, not with relief, but with recognition, like something in her had been quietly affirmed. That night, I flew back to Chicago and walked into the office before sunrise. The place was still. No investors. No journalists. No noise. Just our product dashboard, glowing against the wall, and the hum of something still alive. I made coffee, pulled out a blank sheet, and started sketching version 2 of the engine. Not because anyone expected it, not because we needed to chase the next shiny breakthrough, but because I still believed in the core idea that started it all. Building tech that understood people better, not to manipulate them, but to serve them, quietly, responsibly, authentically. The last message I ever received from Caleb came 3 weeks later. One line: "I underestimated you." No punctuation. No sign-off. I didn't reply. He wasn't wrong. But he wasn't the point anymore. My story wasn't about outlasting him. It was about reclaiming the space I was never supposed to be allowed in, and building something that could stand on its own without asking permission to exist. Sometimes, people ask me why I never went public with the betrayal. Why I didn't file lawsuits or take interviews that would paint everything in the light it probably deserved. The answer is simple. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. I wanted proof that you can recover without becoming cruel. That you can win without needing someone else to lose louder. I built something real. Something that works. And that, in the end, speaks louder than anything Caleb or my father ever said. So if you're watching this and you've been written off, replaced, or erased from your own work, let me tell you what I wish someone had told me. You don't need a spotlight to build something lasting. You don't need applause to matter. And you don't need revenge to reclaim your name. Just keep building, quietly, relentlessly, and one day, when the noise settles, you'll be the only one still standing. Not because you shouted over them, but because you never stopped doing the work.